One afternoon in January of 1998, a prosecutor for the state of Georgia sat in the very back row of seats in a courtroom where a divorce trial was unfolding. Now, this prosecutor was not involved in this divorce case. He handled murder trials, but he had still come here today because he had gotten a very surprising phone call about an unsolved murder case he had worked on a year and a half earlier. The caller had told him that the testimony in this divorce case could potentially solve that murder. Now, in the courtroom, the prosecutor felt his heart rate pick up as the witness he had been waiting for finally took the stand. And as soon as the witness began talking, the prosecutor knew he had just solved that murder. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast. Because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, on the next very hot day, offer the follow button a nice ice cold cup of water. Except don't tell them it's actually white vinegar. Okay, let's get into today's story. On August 7th, 1996, a 41-year-old entrepreneur named Lance Herndon woke up at 3:00 a.m. to the sound of his alarm clock going off inside of his mansion in Roswell, Georgia. The alarm was actually one of 3 alarms set to go off that morning. The first was at 3:40, the second at 3:50, and the third at 4:00 a.m. And this was actually how every workday began for Lance. He was the founder of a consulting company called Access Inc., and his borderline compulsive work ethic not only made him millions of dollars, but also it had made him a trailblazer for the black business community in Greater Atlanta. His company, Access Inc., had actually been awarded the National Service Firm of the Year award by President George H.W. Bush. President Clinton had honored Lance with the Minority Entrepreneur of the Year award and had appointed him to the 1995 White House Conference on Small Business. Lance sat up and slammed his hand down on the clock to stop the alarm, and then shut off the other 2 alarms so they wouldn't ring. Then, he threw aside his bed sheets and got up and walked over to the dresser to pull out some clothes. On top of his dresser, he kept a sexy lingerie photograph of one of his girlfriends, a woman he'd been seeing for years named Kathy Collins. Now, usually when Lance saw this photograph, he would smile. But today, he flipped it face down so he wouldn't have to look at it. He was going to have to break up with Kathy, and he was not looking forward to it. Lance and Kathy had been off again since they first met 3 years ago, but they'd rekindled things for real about 7 months ago, and she had moved most of her stuff into his house. But for Lance, this progression sort of made the whole thing feel too serious. He sort of preferred to play the field. In fact, at that very moment, he didn't just have this one girlfriend. He had another steady girlfriend, a 27-year-old college student named Dion Baugh. And he was also interested in another woman that he had just met who worked as a school teacher. Plus, he was also still dealing with the fallout from his divorce from his third wife, Janine Herndon, who he had a 4-year-old son with her. Lance actually had to keep meticulous notes in his calendar just to keep all of this straight, and it was really starting to wear on him. Plus, in addition to dumping Kathy, something he knew he needed to do soon, he was also considering dumping Dion as well, because she was the jealous type and he just felt like he didn't need the drama. But for now, Lance threw on a shirt and a pair of pants and then headed downstairs into his basement, where he had a full working office set up for his company. Every day, Lance's small staff of full-time employees, plus his assistant, came to this basement office to do all their work. But they wouldn't actually arrive here for another 4 hours, which gave Lance plenty of time to get everything ready. Lance sat down at his desk, hit the record button on a small tape recorder, and started dictating detailed lists of instructions for each of his employees. Every morning, he would make these cassette tapes so that when his employees came in, they knew exactly what he wanted them to do, even if he had already gone out for the day, which he was doing more and more lately. When Lance had first started Access Inc., he had pretty much worked exclusively on his business all the time and was never really out of the office. But recently, business had not been going very well, and so Lance's attention was now split between, a growing list of problems and new ventures he was considering. He hadn't told anybody the details, but Access Inc. was in pretty big financial trouble. At its peak, It had been valued at more than $3 million, but now the business was heavily in debt and losing money. Lance had tried to diversify by investing in a hip-hop club in downtown Atlanta, but that had failed, and now he was embroiled in a lawsuit with his former business partner. Add all that to the alimony and child support that Lance was paying to his ex-wife, plus the lavish lifestyles he was funding for his various girlfriends. And for the first time in his life, Lance was starting to worry about whether he could even hold everything together. Lance finished the cassette tapes for his employees and left them on their desks. Then he went back upstairs to get ready for his day. By the time his workers actually started arriving at 8:00 a.m. through the designated office side door, Lance was already halfway through his list of daily tasks in his calendar, which meant by the time the late afternoon rolled around, Lance was free to leave his house, and therefore his office, and go to his mother's house to have dinner. His grandmother, who was visiting from out of town, was going to be at this dinner, along with Lance's ex-wife and their son. But despite wanting to see his family, Lance didn't stay for very long. At around 8:00 p.m., he told his mother, his grandmother, his ex-wife, and his son that he had to get back to work. Then, he said goodbye and drove the 5 minutes back to his house. When Lance pulled back into his driveway, he saw his secretary's light blue car parked in its usual spot and he smiled. His secretary was a woman named Taylor Arroway, and she was one of his closest friends. They had been romantic in the past. In fact, Lance's divorce was caused, in part, by the fact that his wife had found racy pictures he had of Taylor, but now their relationship was purely platonic, and they both actually confided in each other about their respective love lives. Taylor worked another full-time job, so she typically only worked evenings for Lance. Lance went in the office door and found Taylor working her way through the list of tasks that he had outlined for her on her cassette tape. Taylor was very obviously happy to see him, and for a little while, the two of them just sat there chatting and catching up. Taylor was apparently having trouble with her partner, a guy named Jazz, and she complained about him a bit. Lance actually knew just because he had lent him some money, and he nodded sympathetically. Lance told Taylor that he was actually hoping for a fresh start in the romance department because he had another new woman, but this one he was really interested in. He said she was a teacher and she was really nice, and he asked Taylor if she would help him write her a card. And like he knew she would, Taylor just laughed. Like, the idea that the ex-girlfriend is now writing a card for the new girlfriend was just kind of comical to her. But this was actually one of the things that Lance really liked best about Taylor, and it's why their relationship continued to flourish. She was just easygoing, unlike his various current girlfriends. And so, Taylor, without any hesitation, helped write the card and then Lance signed it. As Lance stood up to head upstairs, Taylor gestured for him to wait, then she handed him a couple slips of paper. She said they were messages from his girlfriend Dion, who had called for him a couple of times while he was out. At this, Lance groaned. Dion was a lot to deal with. A month earlier, she had shown up at his house, unannounced while Kathy was over. Dion had seen Kathy through the window, and she had made such a scene that Lance actually had to call the police. She actually had a court hearing about that incident tomorrow that Lance was supposed to go to. Lance thanked Taylor for the messages, and then he went upstairs to his bedroom to begin moving Kathy's things out of his closet. About 2.5 hours later, at around 10:30 p.m., Taylor came upstairs and told Lance she'd see him tomorrow. It was raining, so Lance made her promise to call him when she got home so he knew she was safe. And she would do that around 11:30 p.m., and they actually chatted for another few minutes on the phone. But at some point, Lance told Taylor goodnight. He could have talked to her for hours, but he knew that he didn't have long before his morning alarms would start going off. The next morning, August 8th, at exactly 8:00 a.m., one of Lance's employees arrived at his house and unlocked the side office door. And the first thing she noticed when she stepped inside was that Lance was not there once. This was weird because even on days where Lance left early, he was usually at his desk first thing in the morning. But the employee figured that maybe Lance had an appointment, so she went over to his calendar to check to see where he was. But, sort of atypical for him, there was nothing listed for that day. That was when she noticed the second thing. which was that Lance had not left her a cassette tape for the day. And this was not just weird, it was completely unprecedented. Lance had literally never not left her a tape. And so the employee paged Lance, but he didn't answer. So, unsure what else to do, the employee just sat down and started to work. About an hour later, at 9:00 a.m., another employee arrived, but there was still no sign of Lance. The two employees paged him a few more times, but he still didn't answer. And even though both of them considered going upstairs and just checking on him, neither of them felt comfortable doing that. After all, the upstairs was Lance's house. It just felt like an invasion of privacy. Finally, at 10:00 a.m., so 2 hours after that first employee arrived, Lance's mother, who also worked at Access Inc., arrived at her son's house. She had come in through the garage, and when she entered the office, the employees told her that Lance was still not there. She said that didn't make any sense because his car was in the garage. So, the two employees waited in the office while Lance's mother went up to search the house. And for a few minutes, the two employees down in the basement heard nothing. The house was quiet. They could just hear the sound of Lance's mother walking around upstairs. But then, out of nowhere, they heard a scream. About 30 minutes later, around 10:30 a.m., Roswell Police Detective William Anastasio pulled up in front of a mansion that sat on a quiet cul-de-sac in a wealthy community in suburban Georgia. The only thing dispatch had told him was that someone inside of this mansion had been killed. Outside of the mansion, he could see there were police cruisers and ambulances on the street, and his sergeant and a few other investigators were standing in a cluster right near the front door. He walked over to them, and his sergeant briefed him on what they knew so far. The homeowner, Lance Herndon, had been found dead inside of his bed by his own mother after he had failed to show up for work in his basement office. There were no signs of forced entry, and the crime scene itself appeared to be contained to the master bedroom. Lance's employees had discovered that the office laptop was missing, but the rest of the house was filled with expensive electronics and jewelry that had not been touched. The sergeant told Anastasio that uniformed officers were already canvassing the neighborhood and that Anastasio should take the lead in the investigation. So, Anastasio turned and walked inside the house and began going up the stairs to the master bedroom. Outside the door to the bedroom, there was a uniformed officer whose job was to make sure nobody touched anything before the crime scene tech arrived. And so, Anastasio greeted him and told him he understood the protocol. But then he just stood there outside the doorway, not interfering, but looking inside, getting a first glimpse of the actual crime scene. He could see Lance's body on the bed. Lance was on his back with his arms crossed over his chest, and he was naked. Even from a distance, Anastasio could see that whoever had killed Lance had beaten him so badly in the face that his facial bones had basically collapsed inwards. It was like someone truly bashed his head in. But strangely, despite this, it didn't seem like there had been any sort of struggle in this room. I mean, typically with a beating death, there was often a big fight between the victim and the assailant, which can create a very messy scene with furniture knocked over and everything messed around inside the room. But, from the looks of it, it didn't seem like Lance had fought back at all. Like nothing was knocked over, he was just laying there on his back on the bed with his head caved in. And reinforcing the idea that this was not about money, Anastasio could clearly see on the dresser next to the body was a wallet, a stack of credit cards, and a folded up wad of cash. And so, despite the one missing laptop, this didn't really appear to be a robbery. And so, as Anastasio went back down the stairs towards the office he had been told was located in the basement, he was thinking to himself that Lance must have known his killer. This had to have been personal. In the basement office, Anastasio found a police officer standing with a small cluster of very shocked-looking women. One was Lance's grandmother, another was Lance's mother, and the other two were employees of Lance's company. Anastasio spoke with each of them one by one, and Lance's family, their general impression was they had no idea who would want to hurt Lance. Lance's mother told Anastasio that, Lance had just gone through a divorce, which could create some animosity. But he and his ex-wife had stayed on good terms and, in fact, just the night before had a dinner together. Lance's grandmother echoed a similar sentiment that, Lance was this harmless guy, but she also had Alzheimer's and so couldn't really answer any of the questions, at least not credibly. The other two women, the employees of Lance's company, they told a slightly different story to Anastasio. They said there had been some shady people in the office recently, but when he pressed them for specifics, they said all they knew was that Lance was involved in some business disputes. Just then, a uniformed officer opened the basement door and told Anastasio he better get outside. The detective jogged outside, and there at the foot of the long driveway, he saw a woman sitting in a car. The uniformed officer told him that was Lance's ex-wife, Janine. This was not what Anastasio had expected, and he would have preferred to talk to the ex-wife under more controlled circumstances, not suddenly at the crime scene. But it was also an opportunity, because it was very likely that Anastasio would be the first person to tell her that Lance was dead, and in a murder case, the ex-spouse is always a suspect. And so, Anastasio wanted to see how Janine reacted to the news of her ex-husband's murder. So, he walked down to her car, and as he did, Janine got out of the car looking panicked and she told him that someone in the house had paged her. She asked what was going on, but Anastasio, without saying anything, just gestured for her to come with him to his cruiser. Once they were seated inside, he broke the news, and as he did, he carefully watched her. And Janine looked genuinely shocked. She opened and then closed her mouth, like she couldn't even think of what to say, and then her eyes filled with tears, and then in a trembling voice, she asked Anastasio what happened. But Anastasio was not ready to share anything at this point. So instead, he just asked Janine where she had been last night and then waited to see if she got defensive or started stuttering. But she didn't do either of those things. She took a deep breath and then told him she had actually had dinner with Lance and his family the night before, and then after that she went home. Her new partner had come over and spent the night with her, and then that morning she'd gotten up at 7 a.m. to head to her side job as a house cleaner, and then of course, at about 10:30, she'd received that page and here she was. And that detail, that the ex-wife of an obviously very wealthy man was working as a cleaner, caught Anastasio's attention. He wondered if she'd still be working as a cleaner after she received whatever life insurance payout he was certain was going to come her way. But before he could ask her anything about her finances or her job, Janine blurted something out. She said, "My husband was a powerful man with a lot of enemies." By the time Detective Anastasio finished his conversation with Janine, he had gone from having 0 suspects to having 6. There was Janine herself, of course, but Anastasio had been surprised to learn that Lance had been seriously dating at least other women, Kathy Collins and Dion Ball, and that his secretary, Taylor Caraway, was also a former girlfriend. This meant that Janine, Kathy, Dion, and Taylor all had potential motives to want Lance dead. But Janine had actually been much more focused on the men who hated Lance. She said that Lance had always talked about business rivals being jealous of his success, and recently, he'd become embroiled in at least 2 lawsuits that Janine knew of, one with a former business partner over a hip-hop club, and the other with a contractor who said he hadn't been paid yet. Janine had heard that just yesterday, that contractor had actually shown up to a local music show looking for Lance. And when he couldn't find him, apparently he was telling people that, Lance didn't know what he was capable of, as if the contractor could. Inflict harm on Lance if you didn't pay him. Anastasio was not quite sure what to think about any of this, except that he was definitely going to need a lot of DNA samples. That afternoon, Anastasio was back inside of the house, working alongside the crime scene tech, who had finally arrived at about noon. And while he was doing that, 2 other women showed up at the crime scene. One of the women was Lance's secretary and former girlfriend, Taylor Caraway. She said she had seen Lance the night before and that one of his girlfriends, Dion, had kept calling for him over and over and kept leaving increasingly upset messages when he didn't answer Lance. And these messages, Taylor was fielding, and she gave them to Lance when he finally did come home. The other woman who was there with Taylor was Lance's other girlfriend, Kathy Collins. But, unlike Janine and Taylor, Kathy didn't even try to act like she wanted to help with this investigation. Instead, she demanded to be lead inside the house to go get her clothes. The uniformed officers on the scene told her that she couldn't do that because this was a crime scene, but Kathy didn't seem to care at all. And so the officers took down her name and contact info, and they also made a note that Kathy had not shed a single tear. Shutterstock. Early the next morning, Detective Anastasio went to the medical examiner's office to observe the autopsy. He'd been at the crime scene until late, and once the crime scene tech processed everything, he got a closer look at the physical evidence. And a couple things that stood out to him. First, Lance had 3 alarm clocks, and all of them had been unplugged. And one of the alarm clocks was an analog clock, and when it was unplugged, it stopped at whatever time it was, which in this case was 4:00. And so it was theoretically possible that perhaps the clocks began going off while the killer was still inside the house. And so they rushed over and unplugged the clocks to stop the alarm, which then put the likely time of death at, or sometime before 4:10 in the morning on August 8. Second, on the dresser there was a framed photograph of a woman in lingerie that had been turned face down. The picture appeared to be deliberately flipped, not knocked over, as if whoever had flipped it didn't want to look at this picture. And third, inside of Lance's bed sheets were several pieces of long hair that clearly belonged to more than one woman. And there were also some short hairs as well. Now, Anastasio and the medical examiner both looked down at Lance's body. He'd apparently been hit at least 7 times in the face with something long, heavy, and curved at the end. The medical examiner had seen wounds like this once before and thought the murder weapon could be a wrench. However, there was not a single defensive wound on Lance. He clearly had not raised his hands to stop any of the blows that his killer had rained down on him. That, combined with the fact that he'd been found naked in bed with no signs of struggle around him, suggested to Anastasio that the attack had begun when Lance was asleep. The medical examiner said that, judging from the locations of the blows and the blood spatter that he'd seen at the crime scene, the killer had likely climbed on top of Lance before they beat him to death. And this was very significant to Anastasio. On his list of suspects, he had female romantic partners and male business rivals. But whoever had killed Lance had not had to break into the house, because Lance had clearly let them in. And also, Lance felt comfortable enough with them to go to sleep naked near them. Then, to commit the murder, the killer had straddled Lance's chest, which was a very intimate position. And so, to Anastasio, these details all combined suggested that his killer was a woman. When Detective Anastasio got back to the station, he claimed the single interview room inside the Roswell Police Headquarters and began doing interviews. He had a forensics person standing by to get hair samples and fingerprints from all his subjects to match against the crime scene. Anastasio spoke again to Lance's mother, also his ex-wife Janine, and those 2 employees who had been at the house when the body was found, and he took all their DNA. Anastasio didn't really suspect the mother or the employees, but he did have a feeling about Janine. Janine was cooperating, but she would stay on his list until he could definitively nail down her alibi and take a look at her finances. Next up was Kathy Collins, one of Lance's girlfriends who had shown up at the crime scene totally distraught about her clothing. And the moment she sat down in the chair in the interview room, Anastasio recognized her as the woman in that downturned photograph on Lance's dresser. And when Anastasio began asking questions, he sort of half expected her to again ask about her clothes. But instead, Kathy laid out what Anastasio had to admit was a pretty good alibi. Kathy said she had been out of town at a family funeral and had arrived back in Roswell on August 7th in the evening, along with her niece. She and her niece had gotten dinner at a restaurant close to Lance's house and had stayed there until about maybe 10:30 or 11:00 p.m. She then gave Anastasio a receipt from a gas station that was in another state, along with the tab from the restaurant, to back these details up. Although Anastasio noted that she and her niece had only eaten $7 worth of food, which seemed very light for how long they had been there. However, Anastasio knew that, Lance was not killed while Kathy and her niece were allegedly at this restaurant on August 7th. Instead, he was very likely killed in the early morning hours of August 8th, likely around 4:00 a.m. But Kathy said, she had spent the entire night on August 7th into August 8th with her other romantic partner. She said that she and Lance had never really been all that monogamous. In fact, when they met, both of them were married. So when Anastasio asked Kathy if it was possible that Lance might have been thinking about breaking up with her, she just shrugged and said they really weren't that close anymore. She told Anastasio she'd be happy to provide DNA samples and fingerprints because she didn't kill him. Before she got up to leave, Kathy told Anastasio there was one more thing. She said about a month earlier, some woman had come to Lance's home in the middle of the night, freaking out so loudly that Lance had actually called the police. If the police were thinking one of Lance's girlfriends killed him, Kathy said they should start by finding that woman. When the door closed behind Kathy, Anastasio smiled because a record search had already turned up the police report for the incident Kathy was talking about. And that woman, the girlfriend, was Dion Ball, who was already on her way down to the station. When Dion arrived, she took a seat inside the interview room, and right away, Anastasio began grilling her with questions. And immediately, he was suspicious. First of all, Dion's demeanor was very strange. She kept giggling every time she was asked a question. Now, Anastasio knew that likely she was just nervous, and so that by itself was not proof of guilt, but it certainly didn't help her credibility. Second, Dion herself was carrying on multiple romantic relationships just like Lance. And third, perhaps the most suspicious out of all of it, Dion admitted right up front that she had Lance's missing laptop as well as one of his credit cards, and in fact, she had charged $2,700 worth of furniture on it the same night that Lance was murdered. Suddenly, Dion Ball was Anastasio's #1 suspect. And so the detective leaned forward in his chair and asked Dion where she'd been from the evening of August 7th to the morning of August 8th. And her alibi was very weak. She said she had been at home without her husband or her daughter, who were visiting family. In fact, Dion said there was no one who could confirm this for her. But Dion insisted that she hadn't murdered Lance. She said that Lance did a lot of good stuff for her. He had bought her a beautiful Mercedes car, and he gave her hundreds of dollars in cash every week, plus the use of his credit cards. And then she asked the detective, why would she be so stupid as to make a giant purchase with one of those credit cards on the same night that he was killed? It would be so suspicious. She also said he lent her his laptop all the time for school, and any of his employees could confirm that. Dion said that on August 7th, she had called Lance repeatedly, but he never answered. And then on August 8th, the date his body was found, he was supposed to go with her to court to help her clear the charge she had picked up on the night a month earlier when he had called the cops on her for coming to his home acting crazy. But he hadn't shown up in court. She said she'd been so angry and called him repeatedly throughout the day to see why he blew her off, but he never answered on the 8th. Of course, she said, now she knew why. It was because he was dead. Dion offered Anastasio her phone records. She said she would give DNA samples and her fingerprints. And then she told him she really hoped he solved the case soon because she was afraid. She said that Lance was always paying people to do his dirty work, and until detectives caught his killer, she was going to be looking over her shoulder in case maybe they came for her too. Anastasio would spend the next couple of weeks trying to run down the alibis of every single person and their significant others who might have wanted Lance. Herndon did. It was a long list. Some people the detective did feel ready to rule out. Lance's ex-wife, Janine Herndon, for example, had a solid alibi confirmed by her new partner. And although she would have been the recipient, along with her son, of Lance's life insurance policy, she was already receiving a good amount of money from Lance monthly in the form of alimony and child support, and so Lance was worth more to her alive than dead. And then there were Lance's various business rivals, and they turned out to be very weak suspects, primarily because they all had alibis. Plus, it just seemed very unlikely that Lance would have, let these business rivals into his home late at night without some sort of confrontation. But, as the investigation wore on, other suspects who Anastasio had also been ready to write off started behaving in ways that made them look more suspicious, no less. Kathy Collins, for example, who was really bent out of shape about not getting her clothes back, had supplied a more or less rock-solid alibi, plus DNA and fingerprints. But 6 days after the murder, She had sent a demand letter to the police station listing off every item she had left inside of Lance's home, down to her sunglasses, perfume, and a bottle of wine, asking for all of it back immediately. It was an outrageously cold move from somebody who should have been at least a little sad about Lance's death. And then there was Taylor Garraway, the girlfriend turned secretary / platonic friend. On the day Lance's body was found, she had come to Lance's home because she said she wanted to help. That action could be viewed either as proof that she had nothing to hide, or as inserting herself into the investigation and offering distractions from her own guilt. And after that first day, when she'd been so willing to talk and cooperate, now she had clammed up. Another detective on Anastasio's team had gone to her house to ask some follow-up questions, and she had refused to come to the door at all. Then she'd shown up at the police station with her own lawyer, and that wasn't all. The only thing police had learned during their canvass of the neighborhood on the first day of the investigation was that, apparently, somebody had been spotted driving through the neighborhood in a light blue car at about 4:00 a.m. This timeline matched up with the ballpark time of death of 4:00 a.m., and the vehicle description matched Taylor's own car. However, apparently, people thought they saw him arriving that car at 4:00 a.m. And so, after learning this, Anastasio did some digging, and he discovered that Taylor's partner, Jazz, owed Lance money and that Jazz had a criminal record. And so, while Anastasio doubted that Jazz could have on his own just walked his way into Lance's house, he did think it was quite possible that Taylor could get inside and then maybe open the door for Jazz. Finally, there was Dion Ball, the woman who had shown up at Lance's house, acted crazy and had police called on her. Of all of Lance's girlfriends, her alibi was absolutely the weakest, and her level of anger and outrage at Lance was definitely the highest. Also, she literally had Lance's missing computer and one of his credit cards. But as the days ticked by, Anastasio was realizing that none of the details surrounding Dion were smoking guns. Dion's phone records confirmed her story about making repeated calls to Lance, and Lance's other employees confirmed that Dion did sometimes borrow his laptop that was normal. And Lance's banking information showed that, throughout his entire relationship with Dion, he spent tons of money on her. And so the idea that she would buy, $2,700 of furniture on the night of his murder looked suspicious, but actually appeared to be pretty typical. Dion had willingly given DNA and fingerprints, and the police had matched 3 of the hairs found in Lance's bed to Dion. But they'd also found 13 other hairs that didn't belong to Dion, Lance, or any of the other women they knew Lance had slept with. And since Dion had already admitted to sleeping with Lance in his bed not long before the murder, the hairs really weren't proof of anything Anastasio didn't already know. Detective Anastasio still didn't have the murder weapon either. Now, the medical examiner had guessed that Lance was killed with a wrench, and after interviewing Lance's housekeeper, police had discovered that a wrench was missing from Lance's home. But a missing murder weapon couldn't give any fingerprints, and so far, none of the women that Anastasio had collected prints from had matched prints found in Lance's bedroom. And so, within about a month of Lance's murder, the case that had seemed so hot on that first day was now going cold. More than a year would pass, and in that time, Detective Anastasio would continue to investigate Lance Hernan's murder, but he really didn't make any progress. He stayed in touch with the prosecutor, with both of them hoping that some new lead would turn up, but all their evidence had gotten them nowhere. And so, between business rivals, romantic partners, significant others, it felt like this murder could have possibly been committed by at least 10 different people. That was until January of 1998, when the prosecutor who had been working with Anastasio got a phone call. And on this call, the caller told them that Lance's killer was currently involved in a heated divorce case, and during arguments for that case, the killer had destroyed their own alibi for the night of Lance's murder. Now, it had been 17 months at this point since Lance had been killed, but the prosecutor was still skeptical that the killer would really be so sloppy as to present evidence to a different court that went against what they'd already told local police. But then later that month, the prosecutor went to the divorce trial to watch for himself, and there everything came together. Based on evidence and interviews conducted during an investigation that spanned a year and a half, This is what police believe happened to Lance Herndon in the early morning hours of August 8, 1996. The killer lay in bed next to Lance, listening to him breathe. And as they did, a feeling of rage grew in the killer's chest. Lance was just lying there peacefully sleeping, with no care in the world for how badly he was hurting the killer. Lance didn't know that the killer knew he had lied to them. Lance had fallen asleep thinking that he had the killer fooled, but Lance was wrong, and the killer couldn't stand it any longer. And so, they slipped out of bed and headed downstairs, where they retrieved the wrench they had seen on a countertop earlier. Then, with the weapon in hand, they went back into the master bedroom, got back in bed, and climbed right on top of Lance, straddling him. Then, while Lance slept peacefully right in front of them, the killer raised the wrench up and then brought it down on his face, so hard that Lance was instantly knocked unconscious. And so Lance did nothing as the killer repeatedly smashed the wrench into Lance's face over and over again, until his skull literally caved in and Lance was dead. After the frenzy, the killer climbed off of Lance and cleaned themselves up. Lance's alarm clocks began going off, and the killer panicked and just unplugged them all. Then they put back on their clothes and hurried downstairs. But the killer did not leave right away. Instead, they first went down to Lance's home office and made sure to take his laptop computer with them, something they had checked before they decided to kill him. Because the killer was Dion Ball, one of Lance's many girlfriends. And one thing inside of that laptop helped explain her motive. It was Lance's daily calendar, which he had always updated so meticulously to keep his appointments and his girlfriend straight. But officials said Dion killed Lance in part because of the one thing he had not put into his calendar, which was her court appearance scheduled for the morning of August 8th. Lance had promised to go to court with her on that day to help her clear the charge she'd picked up for coming to his home in the middle of the night a month earlier, but Lance's calendar for August 8th was completely empty. Lance had no intention of going, and Dion knew it. To Dion, this was an unforgivable betrayal, and so she bludgeoned Lance to death. Dion ultimately incriminated herself during her divorce trial by telling the court she had actually gone to Lance's house on August 7, hours before he was killed. Remember, she had told police at the time that she had not done that and she was home alone the whole time, was never at his house. And so, when the prosecutor who sat in on the divorce trial actually heard her testimony, which directly contradicted her alibi that she had given, he had her arrested as soon as she left the courthouse. Ultimately, Dion pleaded guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. She was released in 2011. One day in mid-December 2003, Detective Mark Kelly walked into a small kitchen inside of a home in Fort Worth, Texas. The house belonged to a potential suspect in a homicide case. And while his partner was interviewing that suspect in the other room, Kelly was poking around. And honestly, he wanted to hurry, because the kitchen he was in was disgusting. There was grime all over everything. There was trash everywhere and rotting food. There were dishes stacked up practically to the ceiling. I mean, the place was a complete, festering mess. Kelly could hear his partner talking in the other room as he grabbed the nearest drawer and pulled. And instantly he regretted it. Because when he opened that drawer, about a dozen cockroaches spilled out, crawling all over his hand. And so Kelly gasped and jumped back, and watched as the bugs skittered away. Kelly was ultimately searching for clues here, and so far he hadn't found any. However, as he was standing there in the kitchen, revolted by what he had just seen and felt, he started to wonder if maybe the actual filth of this house, the actual grimminess of this place, what if that's a clue? And as it would turn out, Kelly would be right. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right podcast. Because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please take pictures of the follow button's brand new car and then list their car for sale online. Okay, let's get into today's story. Around 6:00 p.m. on December 10th, 2003, 45-year-old Susie Walmsley unpacked Christmas decorations at her home in the city of Mansfield, Texas, alternating between removing items from boxes and explaining what they were to her 3-year-old granddaughter. Christmas had always been a big deal to Susie, and so every year she went all out. Her 46-year-old husband, Rick, had hung the lights outside last night, and now it was time for her to tackle the interior area. And it was extra important to get it done early this year because their neighbors were coming over for a holiday party in just a few days. The thought gave Susie a little twinge of anxiety, and so she twirled her reed hair around her finger as she watched her granddaughter inspect an ornament. Just then, Susie heard a camera shutter, and she looked up to see Rick taking a picture of the moment. He winked and told her it was a good one before plopping down on the couch and showing their granddaughter another ornament from the box. Susie smiled. She was so happy that Rick got to have these moments with their granddaughter. When their own kids had been young, Rick had worked a lot at his accounting job. This had allowed the family to live in a big house in an exclusive neighborhood, but it had also meant that Rick missed out on a lot. He'd spent long hours at the office while Susie stayed home with their kids, Sarah and Andrew. And so it was Susie who had gotten to go to all of Sarah's cheerleading pep rallies and take Andrew on fishing trips. But now that Rick worked from home and so had more time, it was his turn now with their granddaughter. Just then, Susie heard the door open and a voice call out. Seconds later, Sarah walked into the room. Sarah first gave her little girl a big hug, then she stood and greeted Susie and Rick. But right away, Susie noticed that Sarah looked worried. Susie asked her what was up, and Sarah sort of looked down and said, sort of sheepishly, that she'd gotten another bill. Susie knew that the bill Sarah must be referring to was a legal bill, and it wouldn't be the last. Sarah was right in the middle of a custody battle with her ex-husband, Todd, and Susie and Rick were funding it, which Susie was more than willing to do because she knew Sarah was a great mom, and they wanted to continue seeing their granddaughter as much as they could. But this whole mess was not the first time Sarah's problems had put a lot of stress on the family. Sarah used to be sort of a typical kid, you know. She was an outgoing, bubbly cheerleader with lots of friends and just did typical teenage girl things. But then, by the end of her teen years, she really began leaning into partying and also dating older men. At one point towards the end of high school, Susie and Rick had even kicked her out of the house. But unfortunately, that had backfired because Sarah had moved in with her ex-husband Todd and gotten pregnant. And their relationship resulted in lots of mental health struggles for Sarah and also some substance abuse. But the whole family had still gotten through it, and now Sarah was 25 years old and doing much better, and they had their beautiful granddaughter. So Susie just swallowed down her own complicated feelings about Sarah's newest legal bill and just smiled at her daughter. She told her not to worry about it. She and her father would pay for it. Sarah was visibly relieved and thanked her mother and father, and then not long after that, the family decided to head out for dinner. And at that point, Susie dashed upstairs to let her other child, her 19-year-old son Andrew, know that they were leaving. Andrew still lived at home because he had been going to a community college nearby. However, when Susie got up to his room, she found it was empty, and Susie just shook her head, trying her best to suppress her bitter disappointment. But ultimately, she really wasn't surprised by his absence because Andrew lately had been spending more and more time out of the house. Andrew had always been a pretty quiet kid, but lately, he'd been getting so frustrated and mad so easily and, basically, fought with everybody in the family constantly. And then, just this past fall, Susie had found out that her son had secretly dropped out of community college, even though she and her husband had just bought him a car for having kept up his grades. And ever since, the mood in the house had been tense, to say the least. So Andrew, probably to get away from that tense feeling, had been spending more and more time out of the house with his girlfriend, Chelsea. And so Susie figured that must be where he was now, out with Chelsea. Which was sort of a bummer to Susie, because he'd slipped out without saying anything to anyone, even though they had all talked about how, after dinner that night, the family was going to decorate the Christmas tree, which was a family tradition. And it looked like he wouldn't be there, but there was nothing she could do, so Susie sighed, left the room, and headed downstairs. Hours later, the family was back at home after having dinner and after decorating the Christmas tree. And Rick and Susie were playing a board game with Sarah and their granddaughter, and they were having a nice time until Sarah finally stood up and announced that she was tired and needed to get her daughter off to bed. And just a few minutes after that, They had left the house and suddenly the house felt really quiet. Susie looked around the room, which was now a Christmas wonderland after all the decorating they had done. They had covered the stair banister and the fireplace mantel with wreaths, and the tree was all lit up and bright. There were even presents already under the tree, wrapped and ready for their kids and granddaughter. Susie took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of brownies that she had taken out of the oven just a little bit ago. They were Andrew's favorite, but Andrew was not here. Susie asked Trick if he wanted a brownie, but he didn't answer. And when she looked up, she saw that Rick was starting to doze off on the couch. So she suggested that they both just go upstairs and go to bed. But hours later, Susie lay in bed completely awake. She still had a million things on her mind. Like other presents she still had to buy and the errands, she had to run for the party with the neighbors that was coming up later that week. She tossed and turned a bit longer, but when she just could not sleep, she finally just got up and went downstairs, turned on the TV, and lay down on the couch. And sure enough, not long after laying down and suddenly being surrounded by the sparkle of Christmas lights, Susie felt tired and finally drifted off to sleep. Around 24 hours later at 11:40 p.m. on December 11, a 911 operator sat at their post in the Mansfield police station. They were nearing the end of their shift, so they weren't tired and bleary-eyed, but they snapped back into focus when a call came in. They picked it up and clearly announced themselves, but there was no answer from the caller. However, this wasn't really unusual to the operator. Calls like this are referred to as silent calls and are often an accident or a prank. But a caller who doesn't say anything could also be in danger and may be unable to speak. So the operator followed protocol and looked up the phone number the call was being made from and was able to get an address. 820 Turnberry Drive, Mansfield, Texas. And as soon as the operator had that location, they sent a message to the officers on duty requesting that somebody go to the scene and just make sure everything was okay. Just 4 minutes later, 3 officers pulled up to 820 Turnberry Drive, and they didn't need to do much investigating to see that they were clearly in a wealthy part of town. This was an exclusive neighborhood called Walnut Estates, and the street was lined with all these big, beautiful houses, and number 820 was no exception. It was a sprawling two-story brick home that was clearly getting a jump on Christmas because it was already covered in holiday lights. However, those lights were currently off and the house was dark. It was close to midnight, so the officers guessed the homeowners must have accidentally dialed the emergency line and not known it and then gone to sleep, not realizing what they had done. Regardless, the officers got out of their cruiser and went to the front door to knock and ring the doorbell. And when nobody answered, they went around the side of the house and began to look in the windows. But they couldn't see much, and they also couldn't hear any movement coming from inside. And this did put them a bit on edge because somebody had to have been home in order to call 911 a few minutes ago. And you know, whoever it was, even if it was by mistake, now wasn't answering. So the officers decided they did need to get inside this house because now they were thinking, it was possible that somebody could be injured and maybe unable to respond. When they tried the front door, they found it was locked. So they walked around to look for a way in, and they saw the attached garage door was open. So they opened it up, stepped inside, and called out. Nobody answered, so they kept walking into the house. And as they kept walking into the house, they began to hear this low-pitched electronic droning sound. The officers shined their flashlights through the dark and followed the sound into the kitchen. And there on the counter was the source of that droning sound. It was the receiver of a landline phone that had been left off its hook. At this point, the officers drew their weapons. They didn't know what was going on, but it felt suspicious enough that they should be on guard. As they made their way out of the kitchen, they moved quickly and quietly because they really weren't sure what was waiting for them in the rest of the house. But even with their guards up, they were not ready for the scene they stumbled onto. In the living room, at first glance, even in the dark, it was clear this room was destroyed. And then, as their eyes began to adjust, they saw the room was also covered with blood. There were huge pools of it soaked through the carpet in front of the fireplace, and lamps and furniture had been overturned and spattered with more blood. And then, one of the police officers' flashlight beams landed on the couch, and there, under a blanket that was also soaked with blood, was the body of a woman. For a second, None of the officers said anything. Then, another officer shined his flashlight around the room in a slow circle until the light fell on the body of a man lying face down only a few feet away. 2 victims, both almost certainly dead. The officers called for backup. Not long after that backup call went out, the detective on call for the Mansfield Police Department, Ralph Standifer, stood in the front yard of 820 Turnberry Drive staring up at the hole. All the lights were on inside, and uniformed officers had pulled crime scene tape around the perimeter outside. Flashing police and ambulance lights lit up the street as crime scene techs geared up to begin their job. Standifer rubbed his eyes. He'd been with the department for almost 20 years, but it was still hard to get used to being woken up from a deep sleep by his pager. He was there with another detective, Mark Kelly. They'd already been briefed on the situation. The home was owned by a couple in their 42nds named Rick and Susie Walmsley, and they both appeared to have been shot to death. Now, Standifer hadn't even stepped foot in the house yet, but he already knew there was a lot about this case that didn't make sense. Officers had gone to the scene because of a 911 call that came in less than an hour ago, but it didn't seem like Rick or Susie had made that call. Judging by the state of their bodies, they'd been dead for a lot longer than that. Standifer assumed, this meant that the killer must have made the 911 call, either because they lingered in the home after killing them and then made the call, or they left the scene and then returned at some point to make that 911 call. Standifer knew that, it was possible that somebody else who was not the killer could have anonymously made the call after discovering the bodies, but that felt far-fetched. Like, why would that person not stay and at least give more information to police? And so Standifer was hoping that, once he got inside and looked around, things would make more sense. Standifer and Kelly walked up to the home and pulled plastic booties over their shoes before entering. Once inside, they split up. Kelly went through each room taking video, while Standifer just did a walkthrough of the entire crime scene. Standifer first stopped to examine the front door, and he didn't see anything that indicated it had been forced open. And as he walked through the home, he didn't notice any other doors or windows that showed evidence of forced entry either. However, that was where the killer's smoothness ended. The whole scene was an incredible mess. There were a ton of bloody shoe prints all over the place. There were some bloody fingerprints on the wallpaper in the dining room. There was a knife blade that was missing its handle on the carpet. And then, of course, there was the living room where it looked like an intense, bloody, horrible fight had taken place. In addition to the overturned furniture, there was also a lot of blood splatter and spalches that indicated whoever was bleeding had fallen multiple times. But despite the mess, there wasn't anything obviously missing. The TV was still there. There were still wrapped presents under the tree, and there weren't any open drawers or closets, which you would have expected if somebody was here looking for something to steal. So, Standifer did not think this was a robbery gone wrong. He turned to look at the couch where the woman still lay under the blanket. This was Susie Walmsley. She'd been shot in the head, but her blanket had been pulled up and her expression was almost peaceful, which suggested she might have died while she was still asleep. But this didn't track with the rest of her wounds because whoever had shot her had apparently also stabbed her repeatedly in the neck and torso. It was clear she hadn't struggled though, which suggested she likely was the first one shot. But that meant the killer stabbed her after she was already dead. It was unusual for a killer to use multiple weapons like that, but it also lined up with the rest of the very chaotic crime scene. Whoever did this was clearly frenzied and highly emotional. Standifer frowned and moved away from Susie towards his other victim, her husband, Rick Walmsley. Rick's body was shirtless, so right away Standifer saw that he too had been attacked with multiple weapons. He was covered in slashing wounds, and he'd been shot at least once in the head. But unlike Susie, it was clear to Standifer that Rick had fought with his killer. Rick's fist was clenched tightly, and Standifer saw there were actually a few pieces of hair wrapped around Rick's fingers. And so Standifer put on some gloves, and then he knelt down and he opened up Rick's hand to find strands of dark, long hair inside of his palm. And next to Rick's hand on the carpet was a broken blue hair clip. Standifer knew this could be something major because, at least at first glance, it appeared like in Rick's final moments of life, he had managed to grab the hair of his killer and drip some of it out. And This was incredibly lucky because it meant they would now have an actual piece of forensic evidence, this hair, to test against any suspects that they had. But the evidence was also kind of confusing because the long hair in the feminine-looking clip suggested that Rick had been fighting with a woman. But physically, that just didn't make much sense. Rick was a big guy. He was at least 6 feet tall and at least 200 pounds. And so, Standifer had a hard time imagining a typical woman alone being able to overpower him. Even a strong man might have had trouble dealing with Rick, given Rick's size. So now, as Standifer stood there looking at the hair in the blue clip, he started to wonder if, maybe there wasn't just one killer here. Maybe there were multiple killers, and that's how Rick had been overpowered. Standifer went to go find Detective Kelly. Whether it was one killer or multiple, it was clear the level of brutality at this crime scene suggested there had to have been a personal motive. And so the detectives needed to start making a list of everyone the Walmsleys were close to him. It was almost 0 on the following morning by the time Standifer was done at the scene. When he left the house, he saw that beyond the yellow crime scene tape, there was a crowd of neighbors and news trucks gathered to see what was going on at the Walmsleys. As Standifer walked to his patrol car, a deputy approached him and told him they've been talking to some of these neighbors and they had some information. One person said they heard multiple gunshots around 3:00 a.m. yesterday morning, which was 21 hours before the 911 call came in. And another said that last night around 9:00 p.m., they noticed the Walmsleys had not turned on their Christmas lights, which was unusual for them. Standifer ran through this timeline in his head. If it was true that there were gunshots at 3:00 a.m. on December 11th, and then by 9:00 p.m. later, that same day the house was uncharacteristically dark and the Christmas lights were not on. Well, the reason for that could be because by that time, the Walmsleys were already dead. The 911 call had come about 2.5 hours after that neighbor had noticed the Christmas lights were not on in the house. But somebody was in that house who made the 911 call? And based on this timeline, it seemed it could not have been Rick or Susie because they were dead by the time the 911 call happened. So, who was in the house making that call? Standifer asked the deputies if there was anything else, and they said, yeah, there was anything else. The neighbors had also told them that the Walmsleys had 2 adult children, Sarah and Andrew. Sarah lived in her own apartment, and the deputies had already contacted her. She was on her way to the station. But Andrew still lived with his parents, and the deputies so far had not been able to reach him. At this, Standifer felt himself immediately tense up. Both the Walmsleys children needed to be looked at as suspects. It was highly likely that with the parents both dead, the kids would inherit money, and probably a lot of it, judging from the very upscale neighborhood where their parents live. And the fact that Andrew lived with his parents, but wasn't at home and was currently unreachable made him the much more suspicious of the 2 siblings. But just then, Standifer heard somebody yelling. He looked up to see a dark-haired young man getting out of the driver's side of a Ford Mustang. He was gesturing wildly to a police officer who had stopped the car, pointing to the home, the crime scene, and saying that that was his house. A young woman got out of the passenger side of the vehicle, and Standifer could see she and this young man both looked totally panicked. The detective hustled over to the car and asked the young man what his name was, although he was already pretty sure he knew. It was, in fact, Andrew Walmsley. Andrew told them that he and his girlfriend, the woman he was with, had seen a news report about 2 bodies in this neighborhood being found, and he had driven here to make sure it was not his mother and father. As he said this, Standifer's eyes immediately went to the girlfriend's hair, hoping it was dark brown like the hair he had found inside of Rick's fist. But it was blonde. Standifer was momentarily disappointed, but he knew that the girlfriend's hair color didn't actually prove or disprove anything about Andrew himself. And so Standifer looked around at the news cameras in the crowd and decided he would wait to give Andrew any details about what had happened. And so he just told the young couple to come with him back to the station, where he would explain everything. A short time later, Standifer sat across the table from Andrew inside of an interview room, watching the young man fall apart as he learned his parents were both dead. Andrew looked down at the ground as Standifer broke the news, unable to speak as tears streamed down his cheeks. Standifer waited for Andrew to calm down a little bit, but he didn't really calm down at all. And so, Standifer just began asking basic questions, because it seemed like Andrew was not going to be capable of giving anything more than short, simple answers. He said that he lived with his parents, but stayed at his girlfriend Chelsea's most of the time. And during the period of time that police believed the couple was murdered, Andrew said that he and Chelsea played some miniature golf, they went to the movies, and then they went to a friend's house for most of the night before heading back to Chelsea's to sleep. After that, Andrew went quiet again, staring hard at the floor as his eyes welled up with more tears. To Standifer, Andrew's emotional reaction to this news seemed pretty sincere. And when Standifer looked over Andrew's hands and forearms, looking for any of the telltale cuts or bruises the killer almost certainly would have picked up while fighting with Rick, he only saw one small, shallow scratch on his hand, which, realistically, Andrew could have gotten anywhere. But his emotional reaction and the lack of cuts and bruises on his body was not enough to rule Andrew out, especially if he was potentially working with somebody else. And so Standifer decided to push him a little bit, just to see how he reacted. He told Andrew that he was going to send some officers to check his car for blood, and he was also going to get Andrew's fingerprints. Then he also said he was going to have to confirm his alibi with his girlfriend and friends, and he was going to check his bank records, looking specifically for large payments that could suggest a paid hit. After that, Standifer just stood there waiting for Andrew to get defensive or angry, but Andrew just nodded and said that all sounded fine. And so when Standifer stepped out of the interview room, he was not feeling too optimistic about Andrew as a suspect. And so when his partner, Detective Kelly, came around the corner and said Andrew's sister, Sarah, was in an interview room ready to be spoken to be murdered, Standifer was glad to hear it. The first thing Standifer noticed when he went into Sarah's interrogation room was that Sarah had long, dark hair, which was roughly the same color as the strands he had seen in Rick's hand. Now, he didn't let his excitement show. Instead, he just sat down at the table and simply asked Sarah what she had been doing on December 10th. Like her brother, Sarah was visibly devastated. But, unlike Andrew, who had been barely able to talk, Sarah seemed almost like she was impatient with Standifer's questions. She rattled off her actions on the night of her parents' murder so quickly that Standifer could barely keep up with her. She said that she had gone to her parents' house around 6:00 p.m. and they had all gone out to dinner. They had all briefly come back to the parents' house after, and then Sarah took her daughter and went home for the night. And Sarah seemed like she might just keep on rambling, but Standifer stopped her and just said, "Look, do you know of anyone who might have wanted to hurt your parents?" And at this, Sarah's eyes widened and she nodded furiously, like she had been waiting for this question. She leaned forward and blurted out that this was exactly what she wanted to tell him, because 1 month ago, according to Sarah, somebody had tried to kill her and her parents. She said it happened in November. They had been driving on the highway when, out of nowhere, they heard this loud banging sound. Worried it could be something to do with the car, they pulled over into a parking lot to see what had happened. That's when they found a distinct bullet hole in the rear of their car, near their gas tank. Sarah said they had reported this to police, but despite looking into it, the police never found a suspect. However, Sarah told Standifer that she always suspected her ex-husband, Todd Cleveland, was the shooter. She told the detective that she and Todd were in a custody battle over their daughter, which her parents were paying for. Todd was furious about it. Standifer sat back in his seat, trying to keep his face neutral, but he felt like a bomb had just been dropped in the middle of his case. The Walmsley S had been shot at twice over a 30-day period. Whoever had killed them was brazen and determined. The detective leaned back and folded his arms as he tried to work out what all this meant to him. On one hand, Sarah had been in the car during that first shooting, which made it very unlikely, but not impossible, that she was involved in that attempt. But she also had no real alibi for the night of her parents' murder and had admitted she was in desperate need of money. She was also eager to talk, maybe too eager, and she had pointed the finger right at her ex, which could mean she was trying to distract Standifer from looking at her, or it could mean she was scared and that Todd Cleveland was the shooter and he was guilty. Luckily though, Standifer didn't have to make any decisions about her guilt or innocence on her demeanor alone. He had those strands of hair from the crime scene, so he told Sarah they would need a DNA sample from her. And Standifer had half expected her to protest, but instead she agreed immediately. As Standifer left to get one of the evidence stacks, he felt more confused than ever. Sarah had seemed like a promising suspect, but her willingness to provide DNA told Standifer she likely did not have much to hide. Standifer suddenly felt the weight of how tired he was. He'd been awake all night, and his exhaustion was making it hard to unravel this case that seemed to get murkier with every clue. The next day was December 13th. It had been 2 days since Rick and Susie Walmsley's bodies had been found, and detectives Ralph Standifer and Mark Kelly were standing around a desk at the Mansfield, Texas Police Precinct. They were going over photos, financial documents, witness statements, and the newly released autopsy results, which just confirmed a lot of what they already knew, that both Rick and Susie had been shot and stabbed, and that Rick had fought back very hard. Standifer was more sure than ever that this was a personal crime, so he and Kelly were going over all of the evidence they had on their key suspects, the children, Sarah and Andrew Walmsley. In the last couple of days, they had learned a lot more about the Walmsleys and their children. Standifer had been right. The parents had a big estate that their kids were set to inherit. It was worth over $5 million, and Rick also had a large life insurance policy as well. And so this gave the siblings a very strong financial motivation for killing their parents. But all Standifer could come up with to this point was evidence that actually ruled both the kids out. They had taken Sarah Walmsley's DNA when they interviewed her, and it was not a match for the hair found at the scene, which didn't mean she wasn't somehow involved. But it meant the only real evidence Standifer had against her was her financial motive and a lack of an alibi. As for Andrew, his alibi checked out. His girlfriend, Chelsea Richardson, confirmed his story. The detectives had also contacted one of his friends, a guy named Jeremy Lavender, and he confirmed that Andrew and Chelsea were with him the night Andrew's parents were killed. Plus, Andrew's fingerprints didn't match the bloody ones that were found at the crime scene. There had also been a preliminary search of Andrew's car, and they hadn't seen any obvious blood yet, although the evidence decks were not quite finished. So Standifer and Kelly were at the point in this case where they needed to seriously consider other suspects. And luckily, they already had somebody at the top of their list. Sarah had been sure that her ex-husband, Todd, was responsible for the attack on the Walmsleys that happened a month ago. Standifer had already reached out to the police of the town where the Walmsleys were shot at, and luckily the officers there had extracted the bullet from their card and after testing that bullet, it showed that bullet came from the same gun that was later used to kill the Walmsleys. So, if Todd was a suspect for that attack, well then, by almost default, he had to be a suspect for the murders. So Standifer grabbed his keys off his desk and flagged Kelly to come with him. It was time to go see Todd Cleveland. When the detective sat down with Todd at his home, he seemed extremely agitated and sort of rattled. He said he had just heard about the murders and he was totally stunned. He also said he knew this looked bad for him, but he was adamant he was not involved. He may have been at war with Sarah and Susie, but he liked Trick. And besides, he wasn't around the night of the 10th because he was working. He was a plumber, and he said he had a few emergency jobs that night and in the early morning, too. Standifer and Kelly stayed for a bit longer, but they'd get much more out of Todd. So eventually they left and headed back to the station. And right away they called Todd's plumbing clients to confirm his alibi, and sure enough, it all checked out once again. The detectives were back to square one. The following day, Standifer and Kelly drove out to the home of Andrew's girlfriend, Chelsea. They weren't there because they thought Chelsea was a suspect. Her blonde hair had pretty much ruled her out, but the detectives had decided that since they were already starting over, they may as well begin by re-evaluating their first two suspects, the Walmsley children, Andrew and Sarah. Neither sibling appeared to have been at the crime scene, but Standifer and Kelly wanted to learn more about who they were close to, specifically, who in their lives they might have trusted enough to help them plan or even carry out a murder. When the detectives arrived at Chelsea's mother's house where Chelsea lived, They knocked on the door and Chelsea opened it up, and quickly she invited the detectives inside. And as soon as they stepped in, Standifer just froze, because the house was truly a mess. Not just in disarray, but disgusting. There was trash everywhere and grime on everything. I mean, it really looked deeply dirty and uncared for. The two detectives just looked at each other and raised their eyebrows. Over on the couch was another young woman who looked to be about Chelsea's age. When she saw the detectives, she stood up, walked over, and introduced herself as Chelsea's friend, Susanna. And over the course of their brief conversation, she told them that she had actually been staying in this house with Chelsea for quite a while. After that, Standifer asked Susanna to please give them some privacy, and she nodded and disappeared into a bedroom. At this point, Standifer sat down with Chelsea and began asking her a couple questions about the days around the murders, while his partner Kelly began to pace around the house. Chelsea had already confirmed Andrew's alibi once, but she seemed perfectly willing to go through it again, and nothing about her story changed. And Standifer was just wrapping things up when he heard Kelly gasp in the next room. When Kelly reappeared in the living room, he looked visibly shaken, but he said he was fine. The detectives left shortly after that, and when they got back in the car, Kelly explained why he had reacted like that in the other room. He said he had been looking through all the kitchen drawers because there had been a knife blade at the murder scene, and he wanted to see if its matching handle that was missing was in Chelsea's kitchen. But at some point when he opened up a drawer, a whole bunch of roaches crawled out. That's why he gasped. Standifer grimaced, but also the thought of those roaches made something else click into place that had been bothering him the whole time they were at Chelsea's. He was thinking it seemed very likely somebody living in a place like that, living truly in squalor, might be eager for some money. And so, as they drove back to the station, Standifer decided he needed to widen the range of people he was asking for DNA from. It clearly was not enough to get DNA just from Andrew and Sarah that really had gone nowhere. What they needed to do was also get DNA samples from all of their friends as well. It would take almost a month to collect all the DNA samples they requested, and then the detectives had to wait another 2 months just to get the results back, which arrived on March 30th. And when the results did arrive, Standifer just sat at his desk staring at the results in shock, because now he realized that a major piece of the puzzle had been right in front of him the entire time. Based on these DNA results, the investigation, and also a confession, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Rick and Susie Walmsley in the early morning hours of December 11th, 2003. Just before 3 am on December 11th, the killer stood outside of 820 Turnberry Drive, watching Rick and Susie's garage door slowly rise. As they waited for it to open all the way, they felt both dread and also a sense of nervous anticipation. They had been talking about killing Susie and Rick for months, and actually, they had already tried to do it once before. But now, if everything went according to plan, it was actually going to happen. Once the door was fully open, the killer slipped inside. And as they entered, they could hear the sound of footsteps right behind them, their two accomplices. All three very quietly began to creep through the home. And as they passed through the kitchen, 2 of them grabbed knives. They already had a gun with them, but they figured it didn't hurt to be as prepared as possible. The house was completely silent. It was obvious both Rick and Susie were asleep. The killer was eager to get started because, in their mind, Rick and Susie had more money and a better life than they deserved. And it just was not fair. The killer had nothing. And so, killing Rick and Susie would not only feel good, but it would be the answer to all of their problems. On the other side of what they did, this night was going to be a much better life. And so, with the gun in hand, the killer walked down the hallway to the living room where they found Susie asleep on the couch under a blanket. And the killer, as soon as they were standing over her, raised their gun, aimed it at Susie's head, and fired a shot. And immediately, the killer then hurried upstairs to the bedroom where Rick was, and they shot at him too, except this time their aim was off. Their bullets hit the doorway outside the bedroom, and as Rick jolted up, the killer fired again. This shot hit Rick in the temple, but Rick didn't fall. Instead, to the killer's horror, he ran at the killer and began to fight them. The killer struggled with Rick, and before they knew it, They both were in the living room where Rick managed to force the killer to drop the gun. At this point, one of the two accomplices tried to get Rick off the killer, but while Rick was being pulled away, he managed to grab the killer's hair and dripped some of their hair out of their head along with their hair clip. When Rick then tried to turn and run for the front door, the other accomplice grabbed the gun from the ground and shot Rick in the back, which caused him to finally collapse. But he still wasn't dead, and he looked up at the killer and the accomplices to ask why they were doing this. But the three of them just stared at Rick in shock. They hadn't realized how hard it was going to be to kill someone. And so now they were actually wondering if just shooting Susie once was actually enough to kill her. And so instead of talking to Rick, the killer and one of the accomplices began simultaneously stabbing Rick and Susie over and over again, until they both were for sure dead. The trio then fled the home, and the primary killer spent the rest of the night totally excited about the good fortune that would almost certainly befall them once the bodies were discovered. But after that whole day passed, the next 20 or so hours passed, there still had been no indication that anybody knew Rick and Susie were dead. And this was a problem for the killer and their accomplices, because the sooner the bodies were found, the sooner they would get access to the money that they had killed for. So, just before midnight, they returned to the crime scene, picked up the landline phone, and dialed 911. Then, without saying anything, they placed the phone receiver on the counter and fled the house for a second time. When Detective Standifer got the DNA test results back from the hair that had been found at the crime scene, it told him exactly who had attacked Rick, but the hair didn't actually match any of his suspects. It belonged to someone that they actually hadn't even interviewed. The hair was a match for Susana Toledano, the same Susana who was a friend of Andrew's girlfriend Chelsea, who was present at her house the day they went to go interview her. It would turn out Susana was the one who had fired at Rick and Susie's car back in November, and on the night of the actual murders, it was Susana who shot Susie and fought Rick. She was the primary killer. Susana did this because she needed money, and she had actually been promised a large chunk of it by her accomplices, Andrew and Chelsea's. It was Andrew and Chelsea's idea to murder Susie and Rick. Andrew was furious with his parents because they had cut him off financially after they found out he'd secretly dropped out of college. He was also in love with Chelsea, who didn't have a lot of money, and she lived with a single mother who had to work multiple jobs to barely keep their family afloat. And so the plan was made to murder the parents for money, but it was ultimately Susana who pulled the trigger. Susana, Chelsea, and Andrew were all convicted of murder, and they were all sentenced to life in prison. As for Sarah, she had nothing to do with the murders, and she has never healed from the loss of her parents. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.